Good morning, and thank you for joining our first stakeholder working group meeting. We have begun recording this session, and the presentation will begin shortly. We're just going to wait a few minutes for people to hop on, and then we'll start. Again, we're recording this session for documentation purposes, and we will begin shortly. Good morning. My name is Christina Byrne, and I'm the Department Manager of Public Outreach at the Orange County Transportation Authority. Thank you for joining us this morning for our first stakeholder working group and listening session. We're very pleased to have you joining us this morning. I am accompanied by Dan Fu and Jason Lee at OCTA, as well as Rob Klobosky from HDR. And we are going to go ahead and get started with our presentation this morning. If you have any verbal comments, they will be received after the presentation during the Q&A session. But of course, you are welcome to write written comments and questions in the chat, and that will be monitored throughout. And again, this meeting is being recorded for documentation purposes for our notes and the record of this stakeholder working group meeting and listening session. Next slide. Introductions. If you missed just a moment ago, I'm Christina Byrne, the Department Manager of Public Outreach at OCTA, and I'm joined here this morning with Dan Fu and Jason Lee with OCTA, as well as Rob Klobosky from HDR, and we will be assisting with the presentation today. Next slide. As well, as far as the agenda is concerned, Dan will be going through the Coastal Rail Resiliency Study history and the goals and objectives of this study, as well as the study schedule and key milestones. And then I will be reviewing the study outreach and facilitating the listening session. And we will wrap up our presentation this morning with next steps. Next slide. So at this point, I will pass the presentation over to Dan Fu to go through the history.
Thank you, Christina. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see a lot of familiar names on this for this meeting. So welcome, and really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this meeting and to talk about all things coastal this morning. So next slide, please. So I want to just take a moment and just give some context in terms of why we're here and why we're doing this study. So as many of you agency folks are well aware, there's been a lot going on along the Lausanne corridor over the last several years. And let's just take a moment and maybe hone in on the issues at hand down in South Orange County. So on this particular slide, you can see that there have been a handful of issues that are down in San Clemente, starting with the milepost 206.8. That's the Cypress Shore community. That particular issue popped up back in fall of 2021, and OCTA as well as Metrolink had to take immediate actions to ensure the integrity of the railroad is protected, as well as restoring rail service. And then as we leap forward into the next year, another incident happened with an adjacent landslide. And then most recently, another landslide that's adjacent to the railroad tracks that's led to the closure. Next slide, please. So this is just, the next several slides just gives you an idea of what has been done over the last couple of years or several years down in San Clemente to protect the railroad. With this particular incident at Cypress Shore, it was really twofold. There was the beach recession that led to the integrity of the railroad being compromised as a result of a lack of buffer on the coastal side or seaward side. And then on the inland side, there was an ancient landslide for which there was development, and there was erosion issues that happened a couple years back where the mast was pushing in a westerly direction towards the railroad and thereby shifting the railroad to the west. And so there were some remedial actions that were taken in this particular case with a tieback. You can see in the upper right-hand side with to basically stabilize the ancient landslide. Railroad passenger operations resumed back in April of last year, so this took actually quite a while to restore service. Next slide, please. And then the next incident happened at this particular location is called Casa Romantica. That building you see in the upper left-hand corner is actually a historic site that's owned and it's owned by the city of San Clemente, operated by a nonprofit. And there was a landslide that you can see where the deck just gave out, and hence pushing the debris towards the railroad. And the remedial action there was to install a debris wall to prevent any more debris from coming onto the tracks. And restoration of service resumed back in July of last year. I believe this all happened around spring of last year. So the railroad operations was suspended for several months. Next slide, please. And then most recently, as many of you have seen on the news, this happened at Mariposa Point, where there's a beach trail as well as the pedestrian bridge. You can see in the upper left-hand corner with the landslide, it dislodged a couple segments of the bridge away from the foundation, and subsequently Metrolink and OCTA had to take immediate actions to remove the bridge as well as clear the debris and protect the railroad tracks to ensure there weren't any additional significant impacts. And we're still actually, the passenger rail service is still actually suspended as of January, although there's limited freight service that's been permitted. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to take a moment and talk about the goals and objectives. So the last several slides I had given you kind of the context and the genesis for why we're undertaking this study, which involves a whole host of different stakeholders. So with respect to the Coastal Rail Resiliency Study, what we want to do is basically look at things that could be done in the short term as well as the midterm. And by definition of short term, we're looking at solutions that would last upwards of a decade. And then in terms of midterm, upwards of several decades. And that's really the key, is to protect the railroad in place and the key is to minimize any more surprises, meaning any more issues that's popping up that's causing suspension of service. And then the other key component of this particular study is that we need to work with a whole host of different stakeholders, from the local homeowners association to interest groups to regulatory agencies and our neighbors that are along this 7-mile stretch of the study area. And so the study area entails effectively from the Orange County, San Diego County line all the way up to approximately just north of the Dana Point segment of the railroad, and it's about 7 miles. Next slide, please. So what we did in terms of understanding that there's been a lot of issues over the last handful of years, and if you, for those of you who are well aware and well-versed with the railroad history in whether it's in San Diego County or Orange County or Los Angeles County, when you kind of look back over the last 100 years, there's been incidents and closure as a result of, let's just say, landslides or other incidents over the last 100 years. And they have occurred generally, give or take, every 20 or 30 years, you'll have a major incident that will lead to a closure. But when you look at the most recent history, starting at around 2021, there's been so many of these incidents that have all occurred in such a short span of time. And so that necessitated us to take a pause and not only look at the short and midterm solutions, but rather let's take a pause and look at what can be done to minimize any more of these surprises, I call them. And so with that, we initiated or we undertook this initial assessment to look at the 7-mile stretch of this railroad to see what issues are out there and what issues need to be monitored, as well as are there any critical areas that require immediate attention? And I'll get into more details about those kind of different buckets of lists that we have identified. And I think the key is we want to basically minimize any more surprises with railroad closures as recently as the milepost 204.2 that we're seeing down in San Clemente. Next slide, please. Next slide. So with respect to the initial assessment, I just want to take a moment and just really share that it's really the focus of minimizing any more surprises and railroad closures. So we want to basically look at the adjacency to the existing railroad, whether it's on the seaward side or on the inland side, that's led to some unexpected closures over the last couple of years. So next slide, please. So in this particular assessment, the initial assessment, we have basically two buckets. The first is really a bucket of areas that we really need to keep an eye on. They don't necessarily rise to the occasion of needing immediate attention, although I would argue that when you look at item 4, and I'll come back to item number 4 or area number 4, but when you look at these 7 areas, you can kind of see a pattern that by and large, there's quite a bit of a situation with beach erosion on the seaward side. And those are areas that we need to keep an eye on. And it's effectively trending in the wrong direction in terms of the lack of beach. And that obviously can or will compromise the railroad integrity. And then when you look at area number 4, that's already kind of set in motion in terms of what has happened shortly after we identified all 7 of these areas. And then there's that area number 4 that's on the inland side. And by the way, this analysis was undertaken starting in November of last year through about January of this year. So it was about a 3-month span in terms of field reconnaissance as well as desktop analysis on what the risks are. So next slide, please. So starting with areas, monitoring areas number 1 and numbers 1 and 2, you can see that there's a beach erosion at South Doheny, as well as the challenge with the Pochi Beach outfall on the pedestrian underpass. Next slide, please. And then areas number 3 through 5, you can see that at the North Beach segment, there's a lack of beach or receding beach, and therefore there is basically a lack of beach that protects the railroad. And then areas number 4 and 5, that's already a situation where there's a landslide that happened, and the railroad, as a result, the railroad has been suspended. Next slide. And then for monitoring areas numbers 6 and 7, for number 6, this is a recurring issue where there's sedimentation that's coming from the bluffs, and it's coming onto the railroad where in the past we've had temporary closures to clean up the debris. So this is an area that needs to be monitored carefully. And then number 7, that's another area where we've actually had to go out there, or Metrolink in this case, the railroad operator had to go out there and take some actions to address some of the issues with the beach loss. Next slide, please. So these particular, the first 7 that I have shared with you are areas that we're gonna keep an eye on and monitor. And then these 4 areas we have identified are require basically immediate attention. If something isn't done, then we could have another railroad closure as a result of one of these areas basically coming into play in terms of issues. So namely number 3, you can see that that's already set in motion at 204.2 where there's erosion and that led to the rail closure. So with these particular 4 areas, OCTA is working closely with Metrolink to see what the next steps are and what can be done to take immediate actions to try to remedy the situation and try to get ahead of things to minimize any more emergencies. Next slide, please. With area number 1, the recommendation is a engineer revetment. You can see the concept that's on the graphic to the right, and that would effectively help stabilize the track due to a lack of beach on the seaward side. Next slide. A similar situation is happening at area number 2, and so the recommendation is also a similar engineer revetment. And I want to just kind of emphasize that these are really a preliminary assessment of what the solutions are. Once we undertake additional analyses, then the solutions could very well be different. So I'll just kind of caveat the information I'm sharing at this point in time. Next slide. So again, this particular area has already unfortunately been set in motion, and there's already a landslide and a couple segments of the spans of the pedestrian bridge has already been removed as a result of the landslide dislodging the bridge from its foundation. So in terms of the possible solutions, what we're looking at is some sort of a wall, and I know it says catchment wall on there. We're still not sure in terms of whether it's a catchment wall or some sort of a wall to protect the railroad. What's really challenging about this particular site is the fact that there is a lot of, if you will, in simple terms, a lot of things in the way, whether it's a drainage line, whether it's a sewer line, whether it's the pedestrian bridge. There are a lot of impediments in the way for some sort of a solution. So we'll need to work closely with our partners to make sure the solution is something that's not going to preclude the replacement of the bridge that we believe are going to be led by the city of San Clemente in the future, as they're responsible for the operations and maintenance of this pedestrian trail as well as the bridge. Next slide, please. With this particular area, that's similar to areas numbers 1 and 2. There's a lack of beach on the seaward side, and so the possible solution is an engineer revetment. So when you kind of look at the 4 areas, you really have kind of 2 kind of common denominators. 3 of those 4 areas are issues on the seaward side, and then 1 particular area is on the inland side. So next slide, please. So in terms of next steps for the initial assessment, as I mentioned, it's really a preliminary look at identifying the issue areas that are in requirement of immediate attention. And then what we'll need to do is engage some of the key stakeholders, such as the regulatory agencies, to make sure that we can try to get ahead of things. And then we'll continue to refine the procedures for the emergency response. We have gone through that process over the last several years, but I think it's important for us to collectively find a way to streamline things, whether it's the emergency process or the regulatory process. And then I think the other key component of this is, given the complexity with the railroad, where OCTA is the owner, but not necessarily the operator. Metrolink is the operator, but there are also other operators, whether it's the freight operator or the state, in this case, with LoSAN and Amtrak service. And so we'll need to work closely with all of those partners to ensure that we have the best solution on a go-forward basis. And then some of the other things that we want to, again, try to get ahead of things are perhaps look at stockpiling of materials needed for emergency, whether that's to the south where the Metrolink yard is, or other locations that are nearby, such that in the event of an emergency, we have the materials that are ready to go. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll hand it back to Christina on the schedule and the milestones and the key milestones.
Thank you, Dan. Before we move on, I wanted to recognize some of the organizations that are a part of this this meeting today, including State Parks, NCTD, SCAG, SANDAG, California Coastal Commission, BNSF, State Lands Commission, and LoSAN. So thank you all for participating today. And Dan, there is a question in the chat. Would you like to answer that now, or do you want to hold on that? I can read it. Jeremy Smith says, what methods were used to identify problem areas? And what level of coastal engineering or geotechnical investigation was performed? And Ken shared.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeremy. I'll just kind of tee it off and I'll ask either Rob or George from the consultant team from HDR Engineering to kind of get a little more detail on that. As I mentioned earlier, it's a combination of field reconnaissance. So the HDR team had their engineers and other folks out in the field to actually observe the site. So they did actually, I believe it was a 2-week site reconnaissance of ground truthing, what's out there and observing the potential issues out there. And then there's also a literature search on previous analyses and geotechnical studies and so forth. Over the years, there's been a lot over the years in this stretch of the 7-mile stretch of the railroad. And so it's a combination of those two. And then I think there's also discussions among the different experts in terms of what are potential solutions that really the key is to keep the railroad up in operation. So with that, perhaps I'll hand it off to either Rob or George to kind of elaborate a little more on this.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, Dan, you answered it well. The detailed investigation that we performed on the site reconnaissance included coastal folks, geotechnical folks, structural folks. So experts in those areas, and they visually inspected the corridor. In addition to that, we performed desktop studies for past work, geologic, historic landslides, that type of thing, to assess the areas, to understand what we're facing along this corridor. That's really about it. That's all, all of the type of analysis that we've conducted is detailed in the memo or in that coastal study, that initial site assessment study.
Thank you, Rob. And
does that answer your question or any follow-up?
No, that kind of answers it, but I think I'd be interested to see sort of what level that was documented and if that could be shared, just because I think we want to be able to review that stuff as well.
Sure.
Yeah, we're happy to share it. Share that it's a initial assessment technical memo. At the current state, it is being reviewed internally. And what we're hoping to do is to actually share that information with the state. We've been working very closely with the state. And so we'll also disseminate that to the larger group, at some near future point. So it is a technical memo that gives you a lot more detail about how we looked at the mile post by mile post. And so that's how the team was able to come up with all the potential monitoring sites along the 7-mile stretch. And it happened coincidentally to be 7 sites, but they weren't necessarily a single point. And then the same could be said about the 4 reinforcement or potential reinforcement sites.
Great. All right, I'll continue on with the study milestones. As shared, the initial assessment was performed late last year, and we will be releasing that report shortly. Our goal is this month. And then we are currently in the listening sessions portion of the study, and we are doing our best to engage with a wide range of stakeholders, including yourself, and we will continue to receive the feedback from these listening sessions and incorporate it into the study going forward, followed by the purpose and need and evaluation criteria. That draft we expect this spring, and the listening session feedback will inform that process. Next, we'll have the initial concept development, and that will occur, the drafts will occur spring to fall of this year. And again, that will be another touch point. We'll be working with the stakeholder working group and others to share those initial concepts, and then we'll refine those concepts in advance of us developing the final draft feasibility study report. And of course, the final feasibility study report. So it's very important that we have constant dialogue with the stakeholder working group as well as others throughout this process. So you will definitely be hearing from us frequently. Next slide. In regards to the study outreach, as mentioned in that schedule, there's numerous touch points, just starting with this listening session. And then you will be involved in the draft concept outreach milestone, as well as the draft plan outreach. And we look to this group, as well as all those that we're engaging with during this process, to be a part of a feedback loop for us. So please share information regarding this study with others. Let us know if there's any organizations or agencies that we may have missed in our interaction, and we'd be happy to include them in this process. We do have a website that we are updating quite frequently. Currently, we have our project fact sheet on there. We will have a frequently asked questions, as well as that initial assessment memo. As soon as it's available, it will be posted on our website, as well as a way for anyone from the public that can sign up on our database in order to receive updates on this study going forward. Next slide, please. Again, these milestones, I just want to reiterate one more time. It's very important that we get the public's perspective on this study as we move forward. This is a very collaborative study, very collaborative process. And we want you to feel ingrained in this process as we move forward. We will likely have 3 to 4 stakeholder working group meetings as the study moves forward. Next slide, please. So now we'll transition into the listening session portion of our meeting this morning. And I just want to provide a little bit of information regarding the purpose of this listening session. The real crux of these listening sessions is to hear from your agency and the experience that your agency may have along this railroad corridor. We ask that you share freely, and we can make the most out of this interaction today. Of course, as I mentioned previously, this is not your only opportunity to share information with Dan and myself and others. We really want this to be an ongoing dialogue. We're doing our best to identify key stakeholders throughout that we can engage with as this study moves forward. And we really want to share the expectation that we are maintaining in place the existing coastal rail line. That's sort of the guardrails that we have along this study to minimize freight service disruptions for the next 30 years and assess any vulnerabilities and issues and concerns as we move forward. And of course, we're always looking for potential opportunities to further enhance our collaboration with your agency and others. And then throughout this process, throughout all the listening sessions and other milestones, we'll be documenting feedback from your agency and other agencies. So now we're going to transition to the dialogue, and we really want to hear from you. Next slide, please. And when you provide feedback, please announce your agency and your name so we're able to document your feedback appropriately. So the first item we want to review is if you have any comments relative to the specified potential reinforcement areas. And if you could be so kind as to raise your hand or put your comments in the chat, that would be very helpful. I'm just perusing the chat. Please use the raise hand control button to request to speak, or type a written comment using the Zoom chat, please. Also, we put in the chat Anna, we put in the chat the project website, so you have access to that as well. And I see that Jeremy has his hand raised. Jeremy, if you would be so kind as to turn on your mic and what agency you represent.
Sure, yeah, Jeremy Smith, coastal engineer for the California Coastal Commission. I actually had more of a question related to the last few
Go
slides.
ahead.
It's more, so I saw like the timeline for that, the conceptual, plans and for the reinforcement areas seem to be, mid 2025, but Dan was also mentioning some sort of, more immediate areas. So if you could specify or clarify, which areas is OCTA looking at on a more of an immediate basis, and how are those different from the process identified in that timeline?
So thank you for that question, Jeremy. And by the way, I had already reached out to folks at the Coastal Commission for a one-on-one meeting. So I think that's the other piece I want to add for the group as a whole. If there's an interest on having focus meeting, one-on-one meetings with OCTA and our consultant team, we're more than happy to set those up. In fact, some of the folks on this call, we have already had those meetings with. So in terms of the 4 areas, how they're different than the larger study, as I noted earlier, with respect to the initial assessment, we want to really work on minimizing any more surprises. And I think over the last several years, we've worked with folks over at the Coastal Commission and the State Lands Commission and others. I don't think any of the agency folks want to see any more surprises. And so I think that we all have the same unified goal as far as trying to get ahead of things. And so in terms of the initial assessment, and that's basically, if you will, the 7 monitoring areas, the 4 reinforcement sites. So maybe, well, I'll take a moment and just focus on the 4 reinforcement sites. Those are the 4 sites that the engineering team, based on the field reconnaissance, the literature search and so forth, believe that that's the most critical. If something wasn't done, then we'll end up with an emergency. And I think that really unfortunately underscores the sense of urgency with the 3rd area that you see on this list here with milepost 204 to 204.5, the exact location where we're having the issue is really where on the inland, where there's the landslide that's led to the compromised pedestrian bridge. And so what we want to basically do as next steps is to offshoot, if you will, these 4 critical sites to basically move them along such that we're not waiting around for 2 years. And in the meantime, something else could happen out there where there's going to have another rail closure and suspension and so forth. And we don't know, how long that's going to end up being depending on the situation. So that is something that we want to, and we're very interested in having a focused discussion with the Coastal Commission on kind of, if you will, binning these 4 areas as one project. And then in terms of, what the path forward is. So we want to basically get the coastals input on that. And I know there's an interest on your agency's part to review the initial assessment memo, and by all means, we will get that out. And so I think we will have hopefully a very fruitful discussion as to the path forward for these 4 sites and how we can go about trying to get ahead of things so that we minimize any more surprises.
Are there any more or any additional comments or questions regarding the reinforcement areas?
So one thing, Dan and Jeremy, I don't know if we completely answered your question. I think Dan was asking for the difference between the initial assessment versus the short-term study. So maybe you can go a little bit deeper into that, Dan.
So with respect to the larger study, which is what we talk about in terms of looking at short-term and midterm, those solutions, we don't really know at this point what they are. What we wanted to do, the strategy in this particular case for this particular study and whole endeavor, is to have the stakeholder engagement upfront. Typically, with these large scale studies, we may have meetings up front, but typically we'll come up with the solutions, get the folks to react to whatever the solutions may be. But in this particular case, it's kind of a situation where we feel that it's important to engage everyone out there from really a multifaceted group of stakeholders out there, ranging from the homeowners association to the interest group to the regulatory agencies, the state, and perhaps even the federal government and others, to really get their take on what the issues are out there, that largely the 7-mile stretch of the study area. And then what we want to do is basically go in back and go into the drawing board and figuring out, okay, based on the input and the limitations and so forth, these are things that can and cannot be done in terms of potential solutions. So I know it's not quite answering the question in terms of what exactly the longer term 2-year study is. That's because we want to go through all of these listening sessions that are occurring between now and late spring of this year. And then we'll come up with some additional solutions in terms of protecting the railroad in place for as long as up to several decades.
Yeah, but I think the point is this initial assessment, these initial prioritization of projects that will keep us out of the emergency state are going to be a part of that 2-year, that short-term assessment. We're going to further define that after that, evolve that, where there will be an evolution to the short-term and midterm study after we hear everybody out. But these initial projects are going to be woven into that short-term strategy.
Sorry, if I could just sort of clarify here, because I'm a little confused, and maybe others are on the call as well. But so the Coastal Rail Resiliency Study, I'm sort of interpreting as being larger than just those 7 monitoring sites, correct? It's about sort of the short-term and medium-term potential solutions for the railroad, protecting the railroad. These 7 monitoring sites, 4 of which have been identified to, need more immediate reinforcement. Those are potentially on a sooner timeline than the 2025 timeline of this study. I just want to clarify that.
You're correct. There is a potential for that, and that's why we wanted to engage the likes of your agency and others to make sure that we're trying to get ahead of things, because I think one thing that is undeniable is the fact that when you look at since fall of 2021, we've had a whole handful of major incidents happening along that 7-mile stretch that basically have led to unexpected and in some cases extended railroad closures. So what we want to do is try to get ahead of things and see what can be done in the immediate time frame, and then concurrently look at kind of longer time frame solutions. So it's kind of, if you will, the initial assessment is a mini study within the larger study. That's maybe another way to look at this.
Thanks. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm supportive of that.
Before I call on Scott, I'm just to acknowledge Mary's comments in the chat. She recommends adding Caltrans and local coastal programs to our outreach list. We will certainly make sure that occurs. And there's a comment that NCTD will be launching a climate adaptation and infrastructure resiliency plan for the NCTD service area this year. And she hopes to collaborate more with our team, of course, as the studies progress, and share any recommended contact persons. That would be much appreciated. Absolutely, we will follow up in regards to that. And before I call on, or I read Jerry's comment, I'm going to go to Scott. Scott, if you could introduce yourself.
Was that for Scott from State Parks?
Yes, Scott Kibbe.
Oh, hello. Yeah, my name is Scott Kibbe. I am the park superintendent for San Clemente, San Onofre, and Doheny State Beaches, which is the south sector of the Orange Coast District of California State Parks. We've been working and just connecting and meeting with OCTA on various different issues regarding the railroad. And we've been able to partner with them on just some public messaging and with posting some press conferences regarding the recent rail work, the bluff stabilization at Cotton's. And obviously anyone from this group, feel free to reach out to me directly with any questions, email or phone. Once I get my vehicle parked, I could throw my information in the chat box, but definitely happy to provide State Parks perspective on this recent discussion that we've been having with OCTA.
Great, thank you, Scott. Also, I was reminded, Mary, that Caltrans District 12 is a part of our project development team, our PDT, so they did participate in that meeting in January. And then Jerry, go ahead.
Sorry, I have my hand raised. This is Riley Pratt, also from State Parks, and I did have just one comment, and also, well, two comments, I guess. At first, I appreciate the opportunity to meet last week, to have that sort of one-on-one that, Dan, that you had mentioned you would be reaching out. So thank you again for that discussion. One thing I didn't mention at that, and I think is, as representing, I think just a lot of public that use the beaches, state beaches, as well as the beaches in these more immediate areas, or the areas where these immediate issues are, which I guess includes San Clemente State Beach on area number 4. I understand the bind that you're in, that you need to protect the rail line in place, and that's going to be accomplished primarily with rock revetment. If that could be done in conjunction with some level of beach nourishment, I think that would accomplish both the protection that you're seeking, plus the public recreation opportunities that I know that we hear a lot about, that I know that sometimes can get squeezed when you add rock, because then you lose that that real estate. But if the two could be done in conjunction, I know that the city of San Clemente has already got a big project underway. I hope we get some benefit from that. But I just want to put that out there as something to consider as you move forward with these kind of immediate, kind of midterm solutions.
Thank you, Riley. I just want to maybe touch on that really quickly. Yes, we do believe that it's necessary to have more of a holistic approach. But what we want to also make sure of is some things may take longer than others. So I think that's where we want to really work closely with the partners, whether it's state parks or the Coastal Commission or others, to see what can be implemented in the immediate time frame. It may be a little bit shorter or longer time frame, depending on what the various solutions are. But I think the key is there's really no one solutions that's going to fix the issue out there. It's going to be basically kind of a multifaceted approach. So I do agree with you, and thank you for that comment.
Jeff Plovnik, before I call on you, I'm going to go to Jerry Romana in the chat. His comment is there any thought being given to possible impacts by expansion projects being planned for areas in the study area? The SCORE project to expand the double track from CP Sarah down to Beach South.
So right now, the goal and objectives are really to address a lot of geotechnical, geologic issues that are happening along that 7-mile stretch. What Metrolink is doing by way of the SCORE program is really more of a capital improvement program of projects. So for the time being, we're not really focused on combining the two, if I'm understanding kind of the question correctly. And I know Jason Lee, who's on this call, is a little more involved on the SCORE program front, so perhaps he can chime in on that. But I think the short answer is we're not looking to really combine the two, but we do understand that there is the SCORE program that's being led by Metrolink.
All right, thank you, Dan. Jeff, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, actually, and less of a question than a comment. I kind of wanted to piggyback off of the previous commenter from Parks. And, we're already looking at one of the projects that you've applied to us with, but just overall, a lot of the solutions that are being, I think, considered here are definitely going to have impacts to public trust resources. And that's definitely going to be of concern to us. And, as you continue the study and look at solutions, I really would like to underscore the importance of continuing to assess how you can mitigate those impacts and take a look at ways that public access and availability of these public trust lands can be sort of emphasized. And I understand that that can take longer, but definitely underscoring that as solutions that you are looking at, ways to mitigate and diminish the impacts that you're having to these lands. I think it's going to be really important as, at least on our side of things, we begin to consider these and just kind of taking a quick look at the map and areas where you've already implemented some of these solutions and are considering more. It looks like there's increasing encroachment onto state lands. So I think definitely within the 7-mile range of your project area here, we're going to need to look at sort of jurisdictional lines and probably need more applications or to expand the existing application for the project area.
Thank you for that comment, Jeff. Yeah, we'll definitely work closely with the State Lands Commission as we undertake these projects, also with the Coastal Commission, the Army Corps of Engineers, and others. I do want to also mention that as part of the larger study, what we're also doing is we don't necessarily want to reinvent the wheel. And by that, I mean, for instance, the city of San Clemente has already undertaken a couple of major projects that are within the 7-mile stretch, along with the County of Orange and OC Parks. So what we want to do, to the extent feasible, to the extent possible, is to actually integrate some of those other project concepts. So just to give you one example, the city of San Clemente had undertaken, I believe it was in partnership with the Coastal Commission, what they call a nature-based solutions along their city limits. And so and in that particular case, that feasibility study looked at all of the improvement concepts that are on the seaboard side. So to the extent possible, where they have groins, jetties, and other improvements that are more nature-based solutions, we're gonna see if we can integrate that into this larger study. So we are looking to do that, and of course, the Army Corps of Engineers has the same replenishment project that's also within the city of San Clemente that we're monitoring closely. So I think I do agree that it's important to actually be aware of all of the different jurisdictions that are out there, which is why this study and this particular area is so complex, because there's just a multitude of different ownership and jurisdictions, whether you look at private ownership or public agency jurisdictions.
All right, before we move on, are there any other conditions that should be assessed as a part of this study that anyone would like to contribute? All right, next slide, please. Some of the other items that we'd like to discuss with you all today is any ideas you have on enhancing railroad stability beyond what was discussed already, and any comments or questions that you may have regarding the goals of the short and midterm study. As you heard, the purpose of this study is to identify and analyze short and medium-term improvement concepts and protect the existing railroad along its current alignment. And this study will not focus on ceasing, realigning, or undergrounding the existing low sand corridor at this time. Any other items that anyone would like to contribute regarding those two bullets? Any ideas regarding enhancing communication on passenger and freight service disruptions? We really tried to be as proactive and transparent as possible during our recent challenges regarding Metrolink service on this corridor. Is there any feedback for us regarding those communications? Do any of the agencies have any comments regarding your role in this process and any way we can better collaborate with you beyond having sessions like this? I know that Dan is in the process of setting up very numerous one-on-ones with various agencies. So if we haven't had the opportunity to do that with you yet, and that's something your agency is interested in, please let Dan and I know. David Berryman, do you have a comment?
Yeah, hi. So I'm with Losan, Capital Program Manager. I just, maybe this more aligns with the second bullet, but it's just kind of reviewing the solutions again, the potential solutions for these monitoring areas. Looks like a lot of it is focused on the beach side with the revetment solutions. My question is, has there been any efforts, or will there be some more efforts looking at and investigating the different bluff, the bluff sides, the side where there's been landslides? Obviously, we've got the 3 that we've already had. Has there been any forensics as to maybe be able to predict and identify what could be the next slide and try and focus on those areas? Or is it just, it's just a complete, you just never know where the earthquake, for example, is going to happen? But I don't know, is there a way to better predict where these slides are going to happen, I guess is my question.
So thank you, David, for that comment and question. As part of the larger study, there is going to be a preliminary geotechnical study, if you will, that's going to look at a more in-depth analysis of the bluff side. What was identified as part of the initial assessment is just really a preliminary cut. And we know that having experienced the milepost 204.2, and I actually didn't mention, there were a whole host of other smaller, basically erosion and bluff failure on the inland side that didn't necessarily, some of those didn't necessarily rise to the occasion of affecting the railroad, had milepost 204.2 had not happened. But nonetheless, depending on the circumstance, weather events, and to your point about earthquake, they very well could have risen to that level of causing another closure. So we are very much cognizant from a standpoint of knowing that it's not just 204.2. In fact, there are other spot locations, at least a couple other spot locations that come to mind that have failed between January and this month. So I think as part of the larger study, we are going to want to make sure to do a more in-depth analysis on the inland side to see if there are any other bluff stability or potential failures that could occur, and then from there determine what can be done in terms of potential solutions to protect the railroad. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yes, just one kind of follow-up then. Would that, I guess, longer-term study, would that also look at, hey, this, after we've done our forensics and after we've done our investigations, we see that, these other areas are vulnerable. Would that then go into this, short-term study and technical memo, to identify that and come up with solutions for bluffs that are, that have been deemed, vulnerable and could go in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever that is?
I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think what we want to basically do is to kind of put a bow around the initial assessment, because we can't keep chasing all the issues that are out there. The initial assessment is really to look at where there are some really high probability risk areas that if nothing was done, then we're going to have another rail closure and perhaps extend the rail closure. And we've already seen one of the 4 areas fail. So I think we want to basically kind of move that ahead in terms of those 4 areas and the solutions. And then in the meantime, look at, again, the 7-mile stretch and see where there are other risk areas that perhaps we have more, whether it's short-term or mid-term solutions. But if I understood your question correctly, I don't think we necessarily want to sort of keep that initial assessment open and continuous, because the point is to kind of move sort of that package of improvements along the way, so something can actually be done out there, in the ground.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good, Dan. Yeah, just want to make sure that that's, those investigations of those bluffs are is part of the plan and it's being looked at, because it's obviously very important from what we've seen in the last few years. So, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, David. In the last couple of minutes that we have for our meeting this morning, is there any topical experts that we should be consulting with in regards to this study that you'd be able to share with us in your travels? If there's anything that you would like to, or anyone you would like to send our way, we would be very interested in that information. If you're comfortable putting it in the chat or following up with an email to Dan or myself, that would be fine. And is there any other thoughts, any other comments or questions folks would like to share with us today?
Christina, there is a comment by Jeremy Smith over at Coastal Commission regarding Brett Sanders out of UCI. So
Okay.
thank you for that comment. Actually, I'm due for a check-in with Brett Sanders again. I had talked to him some time ago regarding the scope of this particular study, and I understand that there's some drone monitoring efforts out of UCI that we want to hopefully be able to tap into and share information. So thank you for that reminder, and I'll be sure to get in touch with Brett and company over at UCI.
Very good. Any other thoughts? I saw that Mary was kind enough to offer up that she'll consult with her colleagues to see if there's any other way that we can enhance our communication. So we'd be certainly open to that as we move forward, if there's any thoughts that come to mind after this meeting today. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, this is our study milestones. And if there's any comments regarding this timeline, any thoughts that you would like to share with us today before we move on? And if there's any others from your organization that you feel would be suited for the stakeholder working group, please don't hesitate to share their information with us. We'd be happy to add them to our invite list for this meeting. And again, we anticipate the stakeholder working group collaborating probably 3 to 4 times over the course of this study. So it's not a huge commitment, but we'd love to have you and your colleagues. All right. Is there any feedback on some of the key themes that we've heard today? Or any comments regarding our approach to public engagement? Is there anything that you could recommend beyond what we've already identified? We will be utilizing your agency to help share information regarding this study on our behalf. And if you have any stakeholder contacts that we should be notifying regarding this, please send them our way. We have a function on the Coastal Rail Resiliency Study website where they could sign up to receive updates as we move forward. And I think there is another hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. No, just a quick feedback on that timeline. I do still find it kind of confusing with the sort of like monitoring areas and reinforcement areas and the separating that from the study. So maybe we could, follow up online if you want to hear more about that feedback. But
sure.
And other than that, looking forward to our one-on-one discussion with the Coastal Commission staff.
Excellent. Very good. All right, next slide, please. I think we covered. Next slide, please. And then next steps. Just want to share with you some of the other listening sessions that we have scheduled coming up now through the end of May. So we are really trying to cast a wide net with various stakeholders to make sure that they're engaged in this process. So you can see we have several coming up through the duration of February, moving into March, April, and May. So if you know of anyone that would like to continue to participate in this process beyond any of these groups, please let us know. Of course, the catch-all is our general public sessions towards the end. We'll have one virtual on April 11th and another on May 21st for the general public in person. More details to follow regarding those, but we're in the process of scheduling those formally now, but these are the dates for these sessions. And then, of course, if you have any questions or concerns, or as we move forward, please don't hesitate to reach out to Dan or myself. And there again is our project website. The fact sheet was also put in the chat, I believe, so you have direct access to that. And as I mentioned, there will be a frequently asked questions added in the initial assessment will be available on our website and also proactively distributed to all of you when it's available. Any last questions before we end the session? All right. If not, thank you so much for your time and have a great rest of your day and happy Valentine's Day. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.